Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to another Zoom presentation organized by the University of Aruba, hosted by the Center for Lifelong Learning. For those who don't know me, my name is Deborah Alexander. I'm the coordinator for the Center for Lifelong Learning, and I'm happy to see that there are many lifelong learners with us here in another interesting presentation today. As with every webinar, I would like to draw your attention to the following. I already see that some of you have already started using the chat box to send general remarks and give a shout out, letting us know who you are, where you're living, and what you're doing. At the end of the presentation, even during the presentation, you can pose your questions via the Q&A box, and this will be answered by our speaker of today. At the end, there's an evaluation form. At the end of the Zoom presentation, once you close the window, there will be an evaluation form for which we do ask you to kindly fill this in, because we appreciate your feedback in looking at ways of improving our services and presentation to you. And last but not least, the video will be made available once it is edited, and it will be uploaded on our YouTube channel. That's the YouTube channel of the University of Aruba. And it will be shared with our newsletter before the holidays start. So before we continue, I would like to give the word to Edward Dresser, who is a teacher at the Faculty of Arts and Science at the Department of Organization, Governance, and Management. And this presentation, a series of two presentations, actually form part of his elective course with a title, Politics, State, and Migration. Edward, over to you.
Deborah. Thanks, Deborah. So, as Deborah said, my name is Edward Dresser, and I teach at the Faculty of Arts and Science. And this and next week's webinar are part of the OGM course, Politics, State, Migration. In this course, we explore how politics, the state, and migration relate with each other. So it's a multidisciplinary course on migration, in which, together with several guest lectures, just like today's and next week's guest lecture, we address questions like, why do people migrate? Who has the right to live where? What is the influence of migration on identity? Is migration a dividing force? Is there a tension between security and human rights? What does it mean to be a refugee? What political responsibility do we as citizens have towards refugees? Because of the importance of the topic of refugees, we, together with the Center of Lifelong Learning and our two lecturers, decided to make these lectures public. So, Deborah, next slide. So, I'm pleased to introduce today's session, which will be on challenges and successes in refugee integration, new insights from international research and practice. It will be taught by our guest lecturer, Kelly Bendelow. Kelly is a protection officer with the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, covering Aruba and Curacao, specializing in humanitarian response and international refugee law. Prior to this assignment, she has worked with UNHCR for over 9 years in a variety of assignments, including Ethiopia, Lebanon, Ecuador, and Geneva, in diverse areas such as general protection, livelihoods, humanitarian assistance, and resettlement. So we are very pleased that she agreed to join us today. So I would say, Kelly, go right ahead.
All right, thanks a lot. Let me just pull up my presentation. All right. So far, so good. All right, thanks everyone for joining. Thank you for the introduction. As the sign behind me indicates, and as Edward mentioned, I work for UNHCR. UNHCR is the UN Refugee Agency. It's an agency, it's one of the specialized agencies of the United Nations, which was established after the Second World War as a way to help governments and help states and to deal with the refugees crises that came out of the Second World War. Now it has expanded and continued on to be one of the larger UN organizations on the ground. We are looking after right now about 79.5 million forcibly displaced people across the world. That's 26 million refugees, 45 million internally displaced people, 4.2 million asylum seekers, and UNHCR also has a mandate related to stateless people and people who were refugees and who've returned back to their countries in some circumstances. Today, we're going to talk a little bit about refugee integration. First, I'm going to talk a little bit about refugees, and then we're going to talk about integration, and then we're going to see how those two things go together. After each of these sections, there's an opportunity to have some questions. So if you have them, please put them in the Q&A and I will take them up, or we can discuss them after each of these sections. And then of course, at the end, there's a space for general discussion if there is any or unanswered questions at that time. The starting point for this is international law and international refugee law, and there's a reason for that. The reason being that it's difficult to sort of understand what we're dealing with in terms of refugees without understanding what is a refugee and what could make someone a refugee, and what are we even looking at, and how do these things fit together. And I'm starting with a point of departure of international law. That might be an area that you're familiar with, and it might not be, but it's important in understanding how some of these concepts fit together. So when we're talking about international law, we're talking about treaties. There's a number of them out there from different sources. There's some international ones, there's some European ones, there's regional ones. These are documents that governments sign and they ratify, and they agree to abide by what is in the treaties. Most treaties are binding, but not all of them are. And most treaties may not have an enforcement mechanism that go with them. So you might have something like the European Convention on Human Rights. That's a convention, it's a European convention. The European states and EU states and also other Council of Europe states can join that. And that one has a court attached, the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg, to see what has happened with the implementation of that convention. The Convention on the Law of the Sea also has a tribunal, for example, but not all conventions have that. There's also a body of international law that doesn't come from a convention. We're talking about customary international law, and the idea behind that is that this is something that states do. States, when I talk about states, I mean governments. It's something that states do, and it's something that so many states do that it's generally held to be something that a state should do. And it sounds a little bit like an odd concept there, but there's a couple areas of customary international law that are well known and well established. One of them being the prohibition against torture, and another one being the prohibition against genocide. So these are both considered parts of customary international law, which means that there's sort of a general agreement that you can't torture people. There's a general agreement that you can't commit genocide. And there are conventions against torture and conventions against genocide, but even if you haven't signed up to those conventions, there's still an expectation that you don't, you as a government don't do either of those two things. This last point that I have is about jus cogens. Jus cogens is customary international law, and the idea of non-derogable means that you can't suspend that right. So there's other rights that you can suspend. You know, you can suspend freedom of speech if somebody is committing hate speech or inciting a riot. You can suspend freedom of liberty if a person's been condemned of a crime, but there's not a circumstance in which a government is justified in suspending the prohibition against torture. And it's not just torture, it's not just genocide, but these are two examples that kind of clarify the concept. And then last but not least, we have the idea of national law. A national law is what governments have agreed to as part of whatever their domestic procedures are. Usually that's for democratic governments, that's parliament or a congress that gets signed into law. You can also have some governments and some legal systems that have, for example, ministerial decrees. You have the issue that many Many treaties might be applicable just the way that they are. So if your government signs up to it, then automatically it applies. And it might be also something that you would need to make a domestic law to implement that. So if the treaty says you have to do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, then you as a government should go back and make a law that says 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in order to have that take effect. Of course, obviously, there's sometimes situations in which a government has signed up for a treaty but hasn't done the national legislation, or there is a conflict between what is in the national law and what is in the international law, how, which one prevails. I don't want to get into all of the legal discussions on that, but these are some of the topics that come up when we're talking about international law. So why I started with that is because where we get the concept of refugees comes from a treaty. And the treaty that it comes from is the 1951 Convention on the Status of Refugees, and there's a 67 protocol. It's basically interchangeable. There's a difference, the difference being that the original convention talked about events that happened in Europe, and it was very specifically directed towards the post-World War II situation. And the 67 protocol basically made it geographically applicable to the whole world and not just to Europe. There's 145 states that signed up to it. There is no enforcement mechanism. There is an argument for customary international law. There's a number of governments that have not signed this treaty but still receive refugees. Great examples of that are much of the Middle East and large parts of Asia. So, all of the refugees that are from Syria in Lebanon, Lebanon is not a signatory to the convention, and yet they still host 1.5 million refugees. But at the same time, it's interesting to look at what are the different arrangements that different governments come up with, and how does that connect, possibly or not connect, to what they would consider an international obligation. So the fundamental concept is that your government and your country of citizenship is not able or willing to protect you, so you have to go somewhere else. The definition, and I'll read it, but of course you can read it yourself, is a person who is owing to a well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, or political opinion, is outside the country of nationality and is unable to, or owing to such fear, unwilling to avail himself or herself of the protection of that country. So, normally if you were going to look at whether or not someone is or isn't a refugee, you'd have to go through each of those terms. Do they have a well-founded fear? Do they have a well-founded fear of being persecuted? Is that persecution related to race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group or political opinion? Are they outside of the country of nationality? And are they unwilling or unable to go back? You would normally do this on an individual basis, but it's not required. There are circumstances, for example, you could imagine one ethnic group persecuting another ethnic group, where the whole population of one ethnic group might have a well-founded fear of persecution. There are, however, other definitions of refugees. We call that the extended refugee definition. There are about three or so widely used other definitions for refugees. One of them comes from the UNHCR statute, which is itself a United Nations General Assembly resolution. There is also an African Union treaty from 1984. And then what we have here is the Cartagena Declaration. The Cartagena Declaration was also done in 1984. It's not a treaty. It is not binding. It is not considered to be binding. It is a statement that governments can agree with and can decide if they want to use, but it's not itself a binding treaty. But it has been used in a number of countries in Latin America as the basis for adjudication of refugee claims. And when you read the definition, it's talking about people who have fled their country because of their lives, security, or freedom have been threatened by generalized violence, foreign aggression, internal conflicts, massive violations of human rights, or other circumstances which have seriously disturbed public order. So when you're contrasting this definition to the previous one, and I'm going to flip back, some of the main differences that you're seeing, and I already highlighted the answer to my question, but it's the word in red that is the important one. One is talking about persecution, and the other one is talking about circumstances. So when you're looking at the assessment, your assessment is about the general circumstances that the person is leaving, also their personal circumstances and their personal connection to that, but it's very often used in a group manner. One example of that, for example, is that Brazil's National Committee for Refugees decided to accept asylum seekers from Venezuela based on this definition on a prima facie basis. Prima facie means that you take the whole group together and instead of going one by one. And based on that declaration, they gave refugee status to around 21,000 Venezuelans. So yeah, that's just to highlight some of the basic terms. One very last one is this concept of international protection. And the idea is to ensure access and enjoyment of rights and services. And this is also a very sort of legalistic type of definition, but that's where the origin, for example, of my job title as protection officer comes from. You know, I'm not a security officer, I'm not a bodyguard. The idea being that my job is to ensure access and enjoyment of rights according to all of these bodies of law. And of course, I didn't go into humanitarian law, human rights law, but when we're talking about protection, you know, the idea of protection from what? These are some of the rights that refugees have. And when we're talking about protection from what, the very first one that I have listed here is the most important one. It's the concept of non-refoulement. So the idea being non-refoulement, refoulement means to return someone to circumstances where they could face persecution. So, you know, you as a refugee have crossed the border, you're at the border, for example, and you're requesting protection and you're saying, look, I can't go back, I can't be in my country because if I do, then they'll kill me, or they'll kill my family, or, you know, I'll be tortured, etc. The government that is accepting your claim or looking at you at the border, they cannot send you back to where you came from if you are at risk of that. And this comes back not only to the Refugee Convention, but also to this customary international law concept of sending back someone to a place where they could be tortured, for example. So it's all this concept of non-refoulement is also considered one of the parts of international customary law. So it's part of the convention and it has a wider scope. Some other things that are in the convention include non-discrimination, freedom of religion, access to the courts, rights to education, freedom of movement, rights to work, rights to housing, rights not to be expelled, and rights not to be punished for illegal entry. The actual convention is a little bit more complicated about how exactly those rights are constructed and who's responsible for them and what they mean. I'm not going to get into all of that, but I just wanted to introduce some of those concepts to see if we can sort of set the basis for the further discussion. Okay, I'm not seeing any questions and answers in the Q&A section. So just a reminder, if you have any questions or want any clarification, please do go ahead and put them there. In the meantime, I will keep going. So we talked about refugees. Now we're talking about integration. But what exactly is integration? And if you go into sort of the sociology behind the concept of integration, you know, we're talking in general, what happens to a person when they've left one country and they're now in another country, and how do they interact with the society where they are now? And there's a couple of different paths, I would say, that you could go along. And I've cited my source on this. This is from someone named Barry, and this was published in 1997. We have a couple options if our hypothetical refugee or migrant, they have an option of assimilation. So that's the idea that they do not wish to maintain their cultural identity, and they really just want to interact as much as possible with the new culture. As an example of that, a friend of mine is the child of Dutch parents who emigrated to Canada. And in the 80s, the fashion in Canada was really to become Canadian. And so she grew up and she doesn't speak any Dutch. And even though she has a Dutch passport, she's 100% Anglophone Canadian, doesn't really have any cultural connection to the Netherlands. And, may or may not have wished to retain the passport, but, she sees herself as 100% Canadian. When we're talking about separation, that's the idea that, a community might draw together and stay among each other and not really interact with other people, they can avoid interacting with other people. So for example, when I lived in Ecuador, there was a bunch of Americans who were teachers at the American school there, and all of them basically hung out together in one group, and none of them learned any Spanish, and their entire social engagement was with other people from their same country, and they lived a separate but parallel existence in Ecuador. And I say that not to criticize them, because I live in Aruba and I still don't speak Papiamento, so sometimes it happens for reasons that are not always intentional. But separation is, in theory, something that the person themselves decides. Then we have marginalization, the idea behind that being there might be an element of exclusion, perhaps, that you have a separate group that is living among each other, and they don't necessarily have interactions outside of their ethnic or their religious or their linguistical group, and they also may be sort of put in those circumstances deliberately, or it might be a focus of some of the socioeconomic aspects of their group. So you have in a lot of places communities where this part of town is the Japanese part of town or the Russian part of town or so on. If that's an organic process, that's one thing. But in some countries, you might even have restrictions on who can buy property or where people can live and so on. And you might also have some deliberate marginalization as well. And then the idea behind integration as a term is the idea that you can sort of have a bit of both. You can maintain your own culture, but you can also interact with other people. And there is a sense that integration compared to these other options is preferable. Sometimes there are reasons why someone might or might not want to integrate. Sometimes you could be in a position where you're only there for a short time, and you don't necessarily want to go to the effort of learning the language. There's a lot of different reasons why people might choose or not choose one of those options. So moving a little bit farther along with Barry, we're also talking about this idea of integration as a two-way process, right? It's something that you do, but it's also something that society eventually also does with you. For me, I've traveled quite a bit and I've lived in quite a number of places. And for me, I see a very big difference between countries that are immigration countries and countries that are more likely to have sort of a long history of being exactly in the same place. In an immigration country could be Argentina, for example, that they had waves of Spanish and Italian, immigration, and you can see how the language has developed because of that. You can see how the society, the architecture has developed as a part of these large numbers of immigrants versus what sometimes you see in Europe of, this particular village has been here for 200 or 2,000 years, and these families go back forever. And it's one is not better than the other. The idea being that the place also changes as a result of migration and integration of new people, and you see some places are more cosmopolitan than others, and you can see the impact that immigration can have on a society and the society can have on the immigrant. So when we're talking about integration as a verb, we're talking about things that you could do as a government to integrate people. We're talking about structural inclusion, so access to health, housing, education, training, employment. And we're also talking about integration, the verb, as something that the person can also do in terms of cultural adjustment, shared norms, social contracts, and so on. All right, but it's a situation that's not always quite so clear-cut, right? We have this idea of assimilation and multiculturalism. Sometimes they are at odds with each other, right? If you have the idea that you should be assimilating, you should be becoming native, so to speak, you might lose out on some of the elements that you could have maintained through multiculturalism. You have the idea of, is integration a process or is it an outcome? And of course, this concept of identity and belonging. The more that I integrate in a certain place, the more I become like the people here. But who am I really? Where am I from? Do I belong here? Is this my home? You'll see this discussion coming up quite a bit with third cultural children, as they're called, people who've grown up in a lot of different countries, and they may or may not have a strong sense of belonging or identity to any particular place or any particular nationality. You ask them, where am I from? And they say, well, my father is French and my mother is Iranian and I grew up in Sri Lanka and Chicago. What does that person consider themselves in this process of integration? So these are some of the questions that come up, and they're relevant for us to keep in mind when we're talking a little bit more in depth about how the integration actually goes. But the reason that I started out talking about refugees, not only because I work for the Refugee Agency, but also because there is a difference in this experience that people have if they are forcibly migrating versus voluntarily migrating. So I was talking a little bit about those American teachers in Ecuador who weren't learning English. They might not have bothered because they're only there for 6 months or a year. They might also decide that their life plan is to move to 2 or 3 or 4 other countries, and there's no reason to invest in that particular country. If you have an optional experience, then you can choose also to pick countries which have languages that you can learn. Hungarian is practically impossible to learn. Finnish is really difficult to learn. Arabic, Chinese, these are not easy languages to learn. So depending on where you are, the barrier to integration might be much higher. If you have the option to study somewhere, you might not see a necessity to learn the language if you're there for a short term, and so on. Now, refugees, they don't have this choice. Forced migration is forced for a reason. If you're fleeing for your life, if you're fleeing for your safety, you don't tend to have much choice in where you go, and you also might not have much choice in how you get there. So before you leave, you might have experienced a number of issues, human rights abuses, kidnapping, torture, deprivation, killings. Personally speaking, I've interviewed hundreds of people who've described these things to me in detail, which I won't repeat here for the sake of not traumatizing you, but there's a lot of things out there that humans do to each other that is absolutely horrible, and there's a lot of people who live through that, and that motivates them to go somewhere else. We also have experiences that happen during the departure, risky journeys, vulnerability to exploitation and abuse, separation and loss. I mean, I spoke to a man in Curacao who came on a boat, and the boat sank, and he watched people drown in front of his eyes, and he's still affected by that experience. And nonetheless, he would still do it again if he had to, because of the circumstances he was leaving behind. But it doesn't mean that those things don't leave a mark. And then, of course, post-arrival, let's say you've managed to successfully take your boat journey, or you leave on foot, or you catch an airplane. What about the fact that you left your family behind? What about the fact that you don't speak the language, you don't have any contacts, you don't have a job, you don't have anywhere to stay, you don't have a legal status, you don't have healthcare, you don't know where to go, you don't have anyone to turn to. So all of these things can have a psychological impact on the person, and the psychological impact can have an impact on if and how the person can integrate. So just to keep that in the back of your minds as we continue. Now, this slide is a slide talking about the kinds of challenges that anyone would have, not just a refugee, any migrant, in terms of identity documents, birth certificates, passports, ID documents. One of the issues we're seeing with the Venezuelans is that the government is not renewing passports, so lots of people have expired IDs. Here in Aruba, you need an apostilled birth certificate to register at the censo, which is fine if that's an easy document for you to get. But I know a guy who was born in Kenya, and even though he's Dutch, getting an apostilled birth certificate from Kenya is near impossible. We're talking also about professional qualifications, whether or not you have your certificate with you, whether or not those certificates are recognized. What about informal networks? Do you have somebody who could recommend you for a job? Everybody sort of knows somebody who's hiring, and oh, my friend, his cousin has a company and they're hiring, or why don't you apply? All of those informal networks you might not have if you're new in a place. Literacy, language, religion, cultural practices. I had a colleague sent here from Algeria to help me with the finances here of the office, and he's a practicing Muslim and he eats halal food. And we went to a restaurant, the Maroc restaurant here, and we said, do you have halal? And they said, what is halal? And they had no familiarity with what food he could or could not eat, because it's not something that's commonly seen in Aruba. And also because it turns out that the restaurant served a different type of cuisine than we had expected. Very good, but still not what we thought. But in any case, those things can make a difference. Administrative procedures, informal restrictions, every civil registry I've ever been to in my life, and there have been many of them, has very inexplicable procedures. You know, they want documents, they don't have a list of which documents they want. Half the time you need to have somebody who knows the system who can help you out. You know, those are the people that never speak English in other countries, even if the rest of the country speaks English, like the people in the censo or the people in the foreigners office are all the ones that are sort of resolutely monolingual. We're also talking about informal restrictions on things in terms of, you know, certain people don't do certain types of jobs, or you know, you need to have certain kinds of qualifications and so on. Resilience is a very interesting topic, and it's one that I think would warrant its own presentation and investigation. But the idea being, you know, how do people respond to these challenges? What are the coping strategies that they identify? What new coping strategies could they identify? And then last but not least, you know, demographics makes a difference. You know, are you healthy? Are you mentally healthy? Do you have a family here? Is your family somewhere else? Do you have breadwinners? It makes a difference to be a single parent with small children versus a healthy young couple with no children, in terms of how many people are providing for the household and how many dependents you have. Okay. Still no questions in the Q&A. Please don't be shy. All right. Okay, so taking all of that together, what does the research actually say about integration, and integration of foreigners generally, and integration of refugees specifically? So what I have here on this slide, these are essentially the stereotypes that come up. These are the things that people think are going to happen if they have refugees and migrants in their society. They're going to have an increase in crime and terrorism. They're going to lose the language. They're going to have problems in the educational system. They're going to have issues related to cultural, you know, different cultural norms. These people aren't like us, and so on. We'll have people who have mental health problems. We'll have people who have a low socioeconomic outcome. Let's imagine, you know, we're importing a bunch of poor people. We're going to make a ghetto. We're going to have, you know, a bad neighborhood develop. We're going to have the government paying lots of money, and it will damage the economy, it will damage the public finance, it will damage the labor market. These are the stereotypes that we have. Okay, so we have already a question, and that's a very good question, and I wanted to add it in here before we keep going. So the difficulty to apply as a refugee differ from different countries, for example, because of politics or culture. So for my anonymous questioner, is that a question about integration, or is this a question about who is a refugee when you talk about apply as a refugee? If you can clarify that, I'll keep going, and then we'll catch it in just a minute. Okay. So here, when we're talking about what the research actually says, the research says a few things. The first one is it's really difficult to have quantitative data on refugees. There's substantially more data on migrants, and there's a few reasons for that. The first one being, coming back to our very original question, who is a refugee? You may or may not have a process that determines this person is a refugee and this person is not a refugee. You may have, well, let me give you an example. When I worked in Ecuador, the government did have an asylum system, and so the refugees, the asylum seekers would apply. The government would look at their case and take a decision, yes or no. But at some point, the government also, the government of Ecuador is part of the Mercosur system, and the Mercosur system established visas for people from any other nationality, from any of these other countries that are also participating. So our refugees in that context were primarily Colombian, and they were eligible for a visa as a Mercosur on the basis of their nationality. And so many people went and applied for that, and they didn't bother to apply for refugee status because, you know, the one the Mercosur visa took 2 weeks and cost $30, and the asylum application could take 2 years, and you had to talk about every horrible thing that someone had ever done to you. So people had a preference for the Mercosur visa. Does that make them not refugees? Not necessarily. Does it make it very difficult to identify them? Absolutely. You also have sometimes with refugees a challenge in accessing them. In my last job, I worked in a refugee camp in Ethiopia, and it was in a very remote area on the border with Somalia, and you need a special government permit to even travel to this part of the country, and you need special permits to even go into the camps. So if you wanted to do data collection or research, there's a lot of paperwork to do before you do. And actually, by the way, there was research done in our camps on the microeconomics of refugees that was published by Oxford University, and there's a paper out there that if anyone's interested, it is possible to do, but it's a little bit difficult. But there's also more data on migrants more generally. Also, statistically speaking, there's a lot more people who would be considered migrants compared to refugees. But the other element that's really difficult is talking about measurable indicators of integration. Within the field that I work in here, there's quite a lot of effort and emphasis on indicators. And for example, for all of our programming, we have two levels. We have one is the number of things that you have done, the number of pieces of assistance that you've distributed, the number of papers that you've written, the number of activities, trainings that you've done, the number of people that you've trained, and so on. But then in theory, you're supposed to be measuring the impact of those. But how do you measure the extent in which people have an increased knowledge about refugee law through our trainings, for example? And the same problem comes with integration. So some of the things that you and I might think are good ways of determining if someone's integrated, for example, facility of the language. What's their level of language ability? That's one way of measuring if a person's integrated. You've also got indicators like, does the person have a job? Are they self-sustaining, or do they rely on government assistance? You can also have indicators about, do they have a wide social network? How much of their social network is people from their own country or nationality or language group, and how many of their social network are more wider? That could be an interesting indicator to look at. You can look at also integration indicators in the sense of self-reported data. Do you feel integrated? That's a qualitative kind of question, which might be really challenging for people to be answering in that format. And so what is an indicator that we want to use? Is it a good indicator, and does it even measure what we think we want to measure? Those are all the real questions that come out. I mean, in general, that's a problem with most social science research. When you want to look at things, you have an indicator, but does it really say what you think it says? So for example, facility in the language. Many of you might be familiar with someone in your community who immigrated here to Aruba some time ago, and maybe it tends to be an older person because language is more difficult to learn when you're older, but you might have an older person there who doesn't speak the language but has lived here for 20 years, but has lots of friends, might have had a job, has lots of community ties, a family support system. Is that person integrated, not integrated? Yes or no? Perhaps yes, perhaps no. You might find people who have, not only do they have a job, they've got 3 jobs. Do they qualify as 3 times as integrated, or should you be looking at it from the concept of underemployment? So anyway, the challenges in how to measure this are quite complicated, and in the following slides, I'm going to go through a number of topics and then describe a little bit how they were measured or how they tried to measure this, and to see how convincing we find that. But when we're talking about policy approaches, one of the key findings from these studies is talking about things that a government can do which would influence the outcomes that the people have and that the society has. One of them is geographic and demographic, so the idea of disbursement versus concentration. In many countries, especially in Africa, you've got restrictions on where people can live. So the reason that we were out there having a nice refugee camp in the desert is because refugees were required to live in a refugee camp. They weren't permitted to live in urban areas. But what impact does that have on their integration, quote unquote, having everybody in a refugee camp versus allowing them to live in a city? You can also look at it from an urban context. Is everybody moving to the same neighborhood? Is this the neighborhood where the refugees live, or are they spread across the city? So, some of the policy choices that you make about accessibility of housing and about potential restrictions can have an impact on how integrated people are or aren't. When we're talking about service inclusion, the idea being that, of course, people have access to your services, and have you made an effort to make your services inclusive? And to give an example of that, I'm American, and my brother was living in the state of North Carolina, and I went to visit him there. And the second language spoken by the ATM was Korean, because they had realized that there is a large Korean population in that particular area, and it was decided to make it easier for everybody to just make some of those documents and some of those services be provided in Korean, rather than trying to have everybody do it in English. When we're talking about integration support, is there an explicit policy or activity or course or initiative that's focusing on helping people learn language, helping people have an education, and helping people have some cultural inclusion? Okay, so this is a good option to look at some of the Q&As before I get into the actual studies. I see the chat box filling up. Okay, so the one difficulties to apply for a refugee is that that's the one that we were looking for clarification on, although I'm not sure that there's a way of knowing what your answer is that connects. Okay, so what research about refugees, immigrants has been done in Aruba or in the Kingdom of the Netherlands? So I've selected the option of asking this live. Let's see if this works. Okay, so research that's been done in the Netherlands, there is quite a lot from different sources. I can point you to some of them. I would start off looking at, there's some advisory council reports, there's some reports done by the Dutch Council for Refugees, the Kuno platform that I'm aware of. There's different people who've done academic research on that. The Netherlands is I would say, is widely represented in refugee studies as many other European countries. Aruba, not so much. There is fairly little research that has been done in Aruba. And also some of the stuff that has been done isn't public, that it's internal research for different purposes. So there's not very much out there for Aruba. There's a little bit more for Curacao. Our office also covers Curacao, but not as much as we would like. And that's one of the areas that we are looking in to see how we can fill that gap. And then that's a very good lead into the following question about, is there any data on refugees and asylum seekers in Aruba? If not, why is there none, or why is this data not available? It really would depend on what you mean by data. So statistics about how many people and how many asylum seekers and refugees are on the island, that's information that DMAS has. And I hear, or I see in articles every once in a while that they publish it. In general, we encourage all countries to publish that on a regular basis. There is a website that UNHCR maintains with that information, and we do request inputs from the government, but they're not always in a position to provide that. The information that is available about Venezuelans in the region is on a website, and that website, I'm going to type it here just so other people can see it. So there is a website where all of the studies that are being done on the Venezuela situation in the entire region, and some of those also include the Caribbean, are published on that website. So that might be an interesting place to start and to see if that is meeting your needs for information. But I think, part of the issue is that you can also spend quite a lot of time collecting data, and everybody has quite a lot of priorities that they're trying to do at the same time. Okay, so there's a question about, are most Venezuelans with illegal status in Aruba refugees or economic migrants? Well, actually, you've got a couple things in there at the same time. So the concept of who is a refugee is anybody who meets the refugee definition that I put up earlier. So there's people on the island that are refugees. You don't need to have it recognized to be a refugee. It's something you are based on the circumstances that you have. Whether or not the government of Aruba is recognizing them is really up to the government of Aruba. So you would see, I think there are fairly few people recognized as refugees. What Aruba has is quite a number of asylum seekers, which are people whose cases are pending. The thing about the illegal status, of course, is a separate issue. Do refugees and asylum seekers have access to a legal status or not? My answer would be generally yes, but I think there's some room for improvement there. But the issue about Venezuelans, so taking another step back, is that the Venezuela situation is what we call a mixed migration situation, which means that it has people who are refugees and it also has people who are economic migrants. Because of the situation in Venezuela, you have people who are fleeing persecution. You have people who have been potentially tortured, people who have been shot, people who've been subject to human rights abuses, and you also have people who are economic migrants who are, fleeing the humanitarian situation in Venezuela. So, you've got a couple questions. The first one being, are you able to tell which one is a refugee and which one isn't? And then secondly, do you have a status available for the refugees or for the economic migrants? I can't really help you out on the question of if most are or are not, mostly because we're not in the business of doing those interviews and adjudicating those cases. So I don't have information on statistics about what percentage are refugees and what percentage are economic migrants, for example. Are there differences in integration experiences between different groups? Yes, and we'll get to that. And we have this question on, today a law was passed to manage funds from the Netherlands to deal with the migration stream from Venezuela. How is this money being destined to assist people applying for asylum? That one I would have to look into and get back to you on it. I've not yet gotten information more specifically on how that money is intended to be spent. I can tell you that the previous requests for assistance from Aruba and from Curacao that were the subject, I think it's something like 24 million. Both of those requests, you can see the letters. I think it's in the second chamber somewhere. They're publicly available, but there has been a portion of that money that was for defense and for Coast Guard, a portion of that money that was for crisis management, and then a portion of that here in Aruba that went to education. There was some that went to a women's shelter, vaccines, and a few other projects. But I would have to look into what this new allocation would be for. And then last question before we keep going, why are refugees not allowed to live in normal communities and have to live in refugee camps? That is the decision of the governments where they live. It's about 60% of people don't live in refugee camps, actually, of refugees. So it's the minority who do live in refugee camps. They tend to be primarily, there's a couple of reasons why governments do that. The first one just being expedience. If you've got hundreds of thousands of people coming across the border, that's usually the easiest way to do service provision for a large amount of people. It's not a great idea in the long term. It's something that we discourage. There's an expression that is very compelling for me, and it says there's nothing more permanent than a temporary solution. And so governments who set up refugee camps eventually discover that they've just built some poorly designed and poorly planned cities that are still there 20 years later. So there's a lot of reasons why we discourage that. But if you look at actually most refugees, they are living in urban settings in different places. When I was working in Lebanon, as I said, 1.5 million refugees against about 5 million local population, and they were not allowed to live in refugee camps. After the experience that Lebanon had with Palestinian refugees, they said all of the Syrians, they cannot live in refugee camps. And we had very few informal settlements made out of tents, but almost everybody was living in private housing, which is actually ideal for a lot of reasons related to some of the topics we'll talk about in integration. Okay, so I'm going to keep going a little bit, and then if there's more questions, I'll check back in with the chat box. So some of the areas that I wanted to look at, and I think I've reordered them, so we'll see what order my slides are talking about, what has been the impact of refugees and migrants. And sometimes these studies talk about refugees, sometimes they talk about migrants, and sometimes they talk about both. But we're looking at fiscal and economic impact, employment and labor markets, language, and housing. So language. The research has shown that language is one of the best and most important areas when we're talking about integration. So it's one of the things that makes, I mean, for the person concerned, they have the absolute most access to opportunities the more they speak the language. For the perspective of the country that's receiving them, of course, that has the lowest impact on their services if people can learn the language. And so the more effort you can do to help people learn a language, the better off everyone will be. So this study that we're talking about is a study from the EU, and it's talking about courses that governments do to teach refugees the language. And one of the conclusions from that is that the level of language tuition that were used in these courses was too low for practical use. But they found that the best, one of the best ways of doing it was having a vocational language tuition. So if you combine it with a work and language opportunity, you have the best case of both an educational, a language outcome and an employment outcome. So an example of that would be if somebody is learning to be a baker and they have an apprenticeship in a bakery where they are working a couple of days a week, and at the same time they are getting language tuition that is related to being a baker. So the language that they're learning is related to the job that they're learning to do, and you do both of these things at the same time. And it gives people both a functional vocabulary, and it also gives them, if you're talking about language learning in children, the way that children naturally learn when they grow up is from context clues. You know, the mother points or the father points at something and says, this is an apple, that is a chair, you know, are you hungry? And connects those words to something, you know, tangible for the child. And if you can replicate a connection to a vocational training, then you have a better outcome on the vocational training and you have a better outcome on the language learning. It's also an outcome of these studies that if you spend a lot of time, this one is talking about education in children, if you're spending a lot of time with a bunch of other children from your same background, it impairs the language learning ability of children and it increases the school dropout. So when we're talking about, and I feel like I might have another slide on education. No, okay. So when we're talking about education for children, it's one of the easiest ways for language acquisition, and children generally pick up language very, very quickly. Again, making reference to my time in Ecuador, we had a family from where were they from? Bangladesh, I think. And they had a whole bunch of small children and they'd been in there for a while, and all of their children spoke completely fluent, unaccented Spanish, even though the parents hadn't really managed to learn. So, you know, the integration prospects for those children was much different having started the educational system in the foreign language. And it turns out that children don't always even need, well, they do need support to learn the language, but at the same time, the younger they are and the more immersed they are, the better off they do. The more separate they are and the most that they spend with people from their own group, the more likely they are to not learn the language and to drop out of school. So when we're talking about housing, you know, again, talking about the stereotypes of, you know, all of, you know, this is the refugee part of town and that type of thing. It is a real challenge for refugees. So these particular studies, and I have the citations at the bottom, there is 2 of them that we were looking at. One of them is an overall study on integration in Europe, and the other one was a specific study on Syrian refugees in Turkey. And some of the conclusions from that is that in general, it's a real struggle to access housing that is appropriate, secure, suitable, and affordable compared to other migrants and host populations. And I have to say, you know, in Lebanon, I was saying that people were living in urban areas, and the people who could afford to pay rent, pay rent. But the people who can't afford to pay rent, they live in garages, they live in storefronts, they lived in unfinished buildings, they lived on rooftops, they lived in a lot of different places. Not all of them were fit for human habitation because affording rent was a very difficult thing for them. Now, for countries that have a reception center for refugees, basically what happens in some countries is that you live in the center, and then once you get a status, then you have to leave. But sometimes there's not much of an overlap. So you get a status and all of a sudden you're supposed to be self-sufficient and have your own housing. And that was found to be exceptionally stressful to people. And you end up having people potentially homeless, living with friends, or so on. There's a couple really horrific articles out there about the situation of, I think, Afghan refugees living in a park in Greece, and they end up, and their children actually, and they end up being exploited for sexual abuse because they are homeless and they're living in this park and they don't have any other option. And it's because they weren't facilitated to get housing, and they weren't once they weren't able to live in a reception center anymore. So one last thing that we see in a conclusion about housing is talking about an increase in rent prices during an influx. So you have a whole bunch of people coming in, that is likely to drive up the rents, and there's especially going to be a demand for higher rent areas as newcomers and locals segregate. One of the impacts that we've also seen, I didn't include it on the slide, is also the idea that in a medium term, you probably will have locals moving out of neighborhoods where refugees tend to live, and they tend to move into nicer places. So it has kind of an impact of pushing people out from the bottom into better housing. But obviously, you know, there is an issue with that because some people never wanted to leave and they don't like the idea of their neighborhood changing and so on. If you do study a little bit where people end up who are pushed out in this fashion, it tends to be towards better housing rather than worse. But that still doesn't, you know, that's a cold comfort to the person who's moving out. But there is a bit of a gentrification effect there. Looking at crime and terrorism. Okay, so the one study that we have here is talking about the United States, and there's an important footnote when we're talking about the United States, and that is that these the word refugee in the U.S. context are people that the government of the United States has chosen from elsewhere and brought in to live as refugees under a program called resettlement. If people who just turn up in the US and apply for refugee status, the US government calls those asylees rather than refugees. So this study is looking at people who were brought in. And the US is one of the largest countries receiving resettled refugees, usually in the vein of 60 to 80,000 per year. The rest of the world combined is about 30 or 40,000. So they have a very large number, comparatively speaking, of refugees that they accept, and they are distributed across the United States in different places. So this is a study looking about that, and they're looking about any connections to crime and terrorism, and they are not really finding any impact on local crime rates, and we're also not seeing any specific impact when we're looking at the countries targeted by the quote-unquote Muslim ban. Part of the reason for that could be also the fact that the screening that people have to go through before they're resettled makes it very unlikely that a person with criminal activity will pass the vetting process. And in the introduction that was made about my background, I used to work in that process, and I was part of the process that screens the people. And then, so we start off as UNHCR screening people, and then the governments, in this case, the United States, also do security checks and screenings that can take a year, 2 years, and so on. So it's a long and it's a very complicated process. But the other aspect, which is interesting, is because they are matched to agencies who have the capacity and the services to facilitate integration. So you have a local integration agency that is monitoring and helping them to detect and correct inappropriate behaviors. So as an example of that, one of these agencies is receiving resettled refugees in the area where I'm from, and my mother went and volunteered as an integration support person for a family of refugees from Myanmar. And so she and 4 other people were all responsible for supporting this family. And the support wasn't financial. I mean, my mother was not asked to provide any money for these people. It was just to help them navigate systems, to help them understand where they could get cheap clothing, to sign them up for certain services, sometimes just to take them out on cultural outings to see different things, but to have a local connection and to have a wide range of local connections to help the family integrate. And that was a very interesting process for me to observe, given that I work in this field and seeing how it looks in the end result. Okay, labor market. Labor market is also a very popular area, and one that a lot of people are concerned about. You know, what happens with all of these people who come in? They're going to take our jobs. They're going to push down wages. They're going to impact our economy, and so on. So these are all studies that also had some things to say about the labor market that weren't all positive. So this first study is talking about there might be adverse effects on the labor markets in terms of employment, wages, and productivity. There's another study that's talking about that migration reduces average wages and increases unemployment of the local workers in the short run, and then it doesn't really have much impact in the long run. A study on from the OSCD argues that there is a greater cost that the government is expending to integrate refugees versus economic migrants, and that the success depends on the policies, on the language training, the school education, the professional training, and the access to the infrastructure. So this on the one hand is talking about the cost of integrating people, and it's also talking about, you know, what you as a government can do to influence the outcome. Employment and labor market impact. So if we're still going on the same theme, there are some trends that you can also observe, and there's quite a lot of studies that are looking into those that I put down on the bottom of the screen. One of the things that you might see about refugees compared to other types of populations is you might have specific barriers. They might have specific challenges, including the loss of identity documentation. You know, if you leave with the clothing on your back, you may or may not have thought to bring your diploma with you. They might not be accepted. So this talking about non-acceptance, I mean, if I am voluntarily migrating to a place, for example, as a foreign student, then presumably they're recognizing my prior, you know, title so that I can go on to study abroad. So then I'm in a situation where I'm migrating, but I'm doing it in a way that my qualifications are recognized, and I probably have to specifically choose a place to do my further studies that would accept my qualifications. Refugees don't necessarily always have that choice. So we're also talking about family separation, all those other things that I was talking about. The impact of that is a high rate of underemployment, downward professional mobility, loss of professional and social status. I seem to have repeated these things on the both sides. So we're talking about educational attainment, lower labor market participation, high likelihood of being overqualified for the current position. So how does that work? How do you have a lower educational attainment and at the same time higher likelihood of being overqualified? Well, as an example, after the Iraq war, there was a whole bunch of Iraqi refugees in quite a lot of different parts of the Middle East, and there was a significant program to resettle them, among other places, to the United States. And they found that the Iraqi population was one of the more difficult populations in terms of their integration outcomes. And the reason that it was challenging for them is that the Iraqis tended to be very well educated, you know, literacy rate 97, 98, 99%, men and women, high levels of university attainment, professionals, so we're talking engineers, we're talking doctors, we're talking lawyers, we're talking people who, you know, business managers, etc. We're talking about the people that when we think about, you know, this people would be a benefit to our society, in theory, those would be the qualifications we would want to have. Well, the problem is if you don't speak the language and they don't recognize your title as a doctor, if you end up as a refugee resettled to the United States, you don't work as a doctor, you work as a cleaner, you work in a factory. And the fall from that previous position into the situation that the people were in really impacted their enthusiasm for integration also. You know, starting over in your mid-50s, in your mid-60s is a lot different than starting a new life in your 20s or in your 30s. There's also a case I had in Ecuador of a guy who used to run hydroelectric plants. And when I met him in Ecuador, he was selling food on the streets. And he basically said, honestly, I've just given up on anything for me. The only thing that exists now is to see if I can get my kids on a better track. But, you know, honestly, I will now work in anything I can find. I've given up the fact that I had a professional life before this. This is my life now. So that's the type of thing that you see when you're talking about refugees integrating into the labor market. But the story doesn't end there. The concept is also about, you know, when you have a whole bunch of new people entering the workforce, Because I mentioned a couple slides ago that you can also have a shock and a decrease in wages and an increase in unemployment in the short run. What that shock also does is pushes people out of unskilled work positions into specialized positions. So in order, you went from the person working in the farms to supervising the people who are working in the farms. The impact that it has on the labor market also shifts what jobs people do. So there is a positive shock to this because it does also eventually lower the unemployment, and it does have a positive impact on the public finances. So when we're talking about the specialization, we're talking about, when you're looking at your labor market, you want to look at what is in your labor market and what are the areas where people are working. Again, I was talking about countries, trying to recruit doctors and professors and so on, because they think that, this is great, I can benefit from this person's experience and I didn't have to pay to educate them and so on. And that's true, but actually countries also need unskilled workers. They need construction workers, they need farm workers, they need cleaning staff, they need care, people who work in care homes. These are all areas of employment that are generally not popular with locals and are generally filled by migrants, immigrants, refugees, etc. So there isn't actually much in terms of an argument that says that refugees are a burden on the labor market. Or a burden on the public finances, rather, you actually see it going around the other way. You see a longer term benefit in terms of higher GDP per capita to recipient countries. So one of the studies on that was talking about immigration to the UK. And I don't know if I still have it on this slide or not. Oh, I do. It's on the next slide, so I'll leave it there. But just one recent study that I just saw the other day is somebody who was trying to analyze the impact on the labor market in Colombia because of the Venezuela situation there and the open door policy. And they didn't really find any particular changes in the formal or the informal sectors because of having this increase in the supply shock. So all of a sudden having a greater number of people who want to be working. So when we're talking about the long-term impact, we're talking about something that is either neutral, so the same as it was before, or it's positive. One of the reasons for that is rates of entrepreneurship and job creation. And it's not, I'm not just saying that because I'm an advocate for refugees, but if you think about coming into a place where you don't necessarily have networks and they don't necessarily recognize your qualifications, one of the things that refugees tend to do is start their own jobs. They work for themselves, they find a business of something that they know how to do, and they work on that. And you see a higher rate of entrepreneurship among refugees and migrants compared to locals. It's a little bit of this existential shock of how do I survive, but you see people preferring to start on their own business, doing whatever that they're doing, or working as an independent contractor rather than formal employment. And you also see that related to people's, in some countries, in the preference for the informal employment economy. When we're talking about fiscal contributions, that's talking about things like taxes. So we're talking about how that interacts with your government budget. You're seeing that you actually have a net contribution. So refugees pay more taxes than they use in services, and that's also true for migrants. You can see some of the numbers that I put down. That study is from the US, and there was also a similar study in the UK, which I have the references for as well. But we're talking about, the question of, in the short term and in the long term, those are different calculations. So in the short term, yes, the people use more services. In the long term, no. You see in some of the statistics I have here, we're talking about at the beginning, you have people who are below perhaps the median household income. But if you fast forward 25 years later, you see them substantially higher than the median income. Okay, so this was the UK study that I was mentioning, and I don't want to go into all of those details. But so if you look in the long term, it's fine. The question is, I think, really for policymakers, how do you accommodate the short-term shocks? Because it's not always so easy. And some of the areas where it's really not so easy is related to some of the differences between a refugee and an economic migrant. So this is a particular study in Switzerland, and they found that in general, mental health concerns and mental health issues is a huge impediment towards integration. Some of the other factors are also related to the policies that are in place. So if we're talking about an asylum seeker that goes on for years, the procedure has gone on for years, you're not sure if you're going to be allowed to stay or not. If you've been put into detention in a refugee camp or in a detention center, if you've been prohibited to work for a long period of time, that does have a big impact on people psychologically. I mean, if you think of the delay, that part is fairly clear. Will I or will I not be able to stay here? Do I invest myself in learning the language or not? I might not do that until I'm sure that I can stay. Detention almost always has a universally negative impact on people's psychological situations. So, but unfortunately, detention is a fairly common practice. And then the prohibition to work. In the system that they have in Ireland, the government pays for the living situation of asylum seekers waiting for their claim to be decided. So you have all of these qualified nurses sitting in this residential area, and they're not allowed to work, even though Ireland has a shortage in qualified nursing staff. So that seems like a bit of a lose-lose situation, the way that they have it set it up. But we're also talking about people who have a visa status. Just because you have a document and a right to work doesn't mean that all of your problems are solved. You might still face language barriers. You might still have little money to survive on, living in poor accommodations. You can't find a job. Your family is still somewhere else. You're discriminated against, etc. That can also result in an increase in mental disorders. So this is also a study that concluded that even after 10 years, they had participants who showed poor integration. And the most close, the indicator that most closely determined that was people with psychological symptoms, but was not really related to the education or the visa status. And speaking a little bit to this concept of resettlement, where somebody is leaving, they're a refugee and another country is going to take them, for example, to go and live in the United States. So in Ecuador, we were looking at Colombian refugees and who were being considered for resettlement in other countries. And we had a number of countries in Latin America, and they said, okay, we only want people who are still at fear for their lives in Ecuador. That that somebody, the armed groups from Colombia are still after them in Ecuador, or they were tortured or suffered violence in Colombia. And they also only wanted people who didn't have any psychological issues. And in my experience, it's impossible to have the one without the other. Being persecuted, being traumatized, being tortured has an impact on you psychologically. And there's just not much that there are things you can do about it. There are mental health support and psychological support that you can get, and there are treatments for PTSD and so on. But if you are trying to find somebody who's got a very compelling case, at the same time, you're also going to have a plan to support the person with their psychological symptoms. And you might not be able to have the same expectations of self-sufficiency that you would have for somebody who just came in as a foreign student and wanted to stay living in the country. So these are really important factors to be considering, and that's one of the areas where you see a big difference among refugees compared to others. So that's what I had in terms of the different studies that have come up. So we have a couple more questions in the chat box. I would encourage you, now is the time to add some more questions, because I think we have a few minutes for discussion. So one of them, difference in integration experiences between different groups. So yeah, we talked about that a little bit. Different groups can have different successes. What is not really a thing is to say that this country or this nationality integrates well and that one doesn't. There's no evidence that supports that kind of a conclusion. The kinds of conclusions that come up are, for example, Burmese refugees resettled to communities in which there is a support network of other Burmese people had better integration outcomes than Burmese who were sent to live by themselves in the middle of nowhere. Or another interesting one was about the experiences of LGBTI refugees. And so when some of those were being resettled, somebody had the idea of saying, okay, well, great, I've got all of these gay Iraqis, let's send them to this place where there's a whole other Iraqi community. Well, that doesn't work very well if the reason that they are, a refugee to start with is because of some of the cultural factors that aren't very welcoming to LGBTI. You're better off sending that refugee to live in a situation that's very LGBTI friendly, but maybe doesn't have a lot of other Iraqis in it. So some of these things are, it does make a difference, but it's not clear cut to say that, one nationality integrates better than others. I have found, at least, I gave the example of the Iraqis struggling because of the professional qualifications. I have to say, and I'm not just partial because I worked with Colombians, but the Colombians tend to have quite good outcomes because they were educated for the most part. I mean, you had a high level of literacy compared to, for example, the refugees I worked with in Africa. And they had a willingness to work in more or less any job that came up. And that really made them fit in quite easily in a lot of different circumstances. Okay, have studies been made on Aruba's population capacity to host refugees and migrants? Not to my knowledge, but we want to look at that actually. So specifically on the capacity to host, I have not seen one, but if you have them, please share them with me. I will say that there was a symposium about a year and a half ago from the Socio and Economic Council in Curacao, and you can find from the SER, you can find all of those presentations online. Some of those presentations were quite interesting. They were from the CBS here in Aruba and in Curacao, and also for the social insurance system. And I think the figure was something like, I think the information that came out of that was indicating that Aruba does actually need migrants in the medium term at a minimum to sustain Alvery and to sustain the pension system, which is actually true of quite a lot of countries. There is a need for migration in order to sustain most developed countries' social systems. So something to look into. Do we monitor the refugee flow from Venezuela to Bonaire as well? Considering the different status as a Dutch municipality, are there influences that are specific to the status over Aruba? So Bonaire is very interesting. Short answer is, do we monitor it? Yes, but not as actively as we are here, for a few reasons. One is that, as far as we know, there are far fewer Venezuelans in Bonaire. Secondly, because of the status as a municipality, Bonaire is covered by our office in The Hague. So it's not falling under our office here in Aruba. But in terms of the different influences that are specific to the status, one thing is really interesting is the asylum system in Bonaire is done by IND, which is the same for the rest of the European Netherlands. And it's not the same system or the same legal system as we have here in Aruba directly, but nobody applies for it in Bonaire. I think there was one case this year and one case the year before, or something like that. So almost no one is applying for asylum in Bonaire. Meanwhile, in Aruba, I think the number who applied last year was close to 2,000. We'd have to ask Dimas for the precise number, but I think the number is something on that order of magnitude. So you have an asylum system in Bonaire, but nobody's applying for it. There's another, actually talking about studies that have been done. There is a researcher he's doing his PhD with the university in Amsterdam, but he's based in Caracas, and he studies the diaspora of Venezuelans in the Dutch Caribbean, including also St. Martin and Bonaire. And I think he has some interesting comments about sort of why people might choose one over the other, the prevalence of local networks, the connections, the historical connections also between Aruba, Curacao, and Falcon in particular, that influence, whether people choose to come to Bonaire, whether people choose to come to Aruba. But it's he's a sociologist, so his starting point is interviews with the people about how they are perceiving that. Okay. So, more questions? I haven't even checked the clock to see how I'm doing on time. Okay, 5:50, so we're coming in just under the wire. What I can do is, oops, I put that one as answered live. Okay. Maybe I can hand this back over somehow.
You can stop sharing, Kelly.
There are still some questions in the chat, I saw.
Oh, okay. I wasn't even looking at the chat.
No, I thought so. So there's, I think, two
Okay.
or three questions.
All right, I see it. All right. With regards, let me start at the top. So the same one about research about immigrants done in Aruba. Given the obstacles to quantify what in terms of data is available to Aruban policymakers to monitor the situation. So when we're talking about, what studies have been done in Aruba and what studies could be done in Aruba, that's actually the question that we're trying to answer. Because there's a few types of data. The first one is the census, and actually the lovely census people just visited our office yesterday. The census is one tool that the government can use to see who is in the country, how many are there, family composition, demographics, and there's a number of other questions about professional background, education, and so on in there that become very useful for knowing the profile of the people. A second part of data available is, well, with COVID, it's a bit tricky, but one of the ways you can talk about is a migratory balance. So how many people came in and how many people left, and is there a difference between those two numbers? So that's one piece of data. Another one can be talking to people like the Chamber of Commerce, the Tourism Association, the hotels, the employment agencies, what proportion of your workforce is foreign born? Those can be tricky questions, right? Because you can be Aruban or American or whatever nationality. So your nationality and where you were born and are you a local, I think, are not always the same thing, and you have to be a little bit careful when you start asking those questions. But if you could, conceivably come up with a certain criteria, you could see, okay, how many workers have a Venezuelan passport or a Colombian passport or an American passport for certain industries. You could also kind of look into which jobs are being held by those workers. Could be an interesting one to look at. What's the impact on the Aruba labor market? Other ones can be in terms of usage of services. So a good question would be looking at how many children are enrolled in school, and that's actually something we've already started doing in consultation with the ministry here and the school boards. And one of our initial conclusions is that we know of more Venezuelan children on Aruba than are in school. So why are these kids not in school? And how many kids are not in school but also not come to our attention? So now we start asking even more questions. So when we're talking about data and policymakers, I think the best place to start is the services that you're looking to make policy about. So if we're talking education, first question is how many kids are enrolled. Second question is what are the educational outcomes of those students? What is the language ability? Do they learn Papiamento? Do they learn Dutch? Do they graduate? Do they drop out? How many are attending school? There's a whole bunch more questions that you could start asking. And if you wanted to set up a monitoring system, you would want to find a way of collecting that data on a regular basis from the different school boards. And here you've got SCOA, you've got SOASA, you've got DPS, it's not so simple as just to have data in one place. And maybe those school boards need to survey their individual schools to get that information. So, always when we're talking about availability of data, the first question is, what do you want to use it for? And is the data you're collecting representing the thing that you want it to represent? So the same question can come out there related to health. That's another area that we're trying to figure out what information should be available. So, one piece of information is the open bills at the hospital for uninsured people. But, that doesn't tell the whole story, because if you are undocumented and you are uninsured, you get medical care if it's an emergency. But the cost would be less if you had gotten preventative care. So the cost of medical care is not entirely accurate to say it's the same as the hospital bills. So yeah, there's a bunch of different areas that we can be looking into. That's part of what we do as our office, is to help kind of break down these concepts into something specific, because it needs to be data driven if we're going to advocate for a certain policy. So why should we be supporting this policy over that policy? Why should we be looking at enrollment rates and not attendance rates and not, so that's the question. What are you looking for? And then who might have that information, and then collecting it and collating it here. So again, we have a little bit of a question on population capacity and how many you can really host. Somebody has suggested a 5-minute break for Kelly to catch some air. That's okay. Breathing is overrated. I don't need air.
That was me.
I thrive off of interest. No. So questions on population capacity and how much you can host. I mean, I think the question isn't how many you can host, because the evidence shows that the carrying capacity of a refugee hosting country is huge. You know, 1 in 5 people in Lebanon is a refugee. That's huge. That's enormous. And they're surviving. And they just came out of 2 civil wars, and they just had a giant bomb go off, and their economy collapsed, and they're somehow managing. But the standard shouldn't be somehow managing. I think the standard should be looking at, you know, what are the ways that Aruba can most use a foreign workforce, and if so, what kind, and if so, from where, and how to manage that. There is a part of our work that, I mean, looking at the statistics, looking at the experience, we treat this type of migration, especially forced migration, as inevitable. You can't, you know, you can't lock people up to prevent them from migrating. You deport them, they'll come back again. If they're fleeing for their lives, they will do anything to get out of that situation. So it's really not about can you stop them, it's really more about how can you most proactively engage with them so that they benefit your society. And I think that's kind of the way that we're starting to look at it as an organization. And we're coming out of an organization that, you know, we grew up making refugee camps. So, you know, I can tell you everything you need to know about how many toilets per people and how many liters of water per day. And, you know, there's that's all fairly straightforward. But the better question is, you know, what opportunities are you wasting by building a refugee camp for people and feeding them 3 meals a day instead of integrating them somehow into your society, into your schools, into your labor market in a way that has the least negative impact for the locals and the most positive impact for everyone.
Oh, thank you, Kelly. Edward, anything you'd like to add to that?
Well, no, maybe that, of course, we have a lecture next week. But now I would like to thank Kelly for this wonderful lecture. It's was really interesting. How are we on time, Deborah?
It's, I think, a few minutes to 6.
A few minutes to 6. So are there any more questions or?
I think yeah. No, I don't see any more questions, and I think they were actually, there were some very good questions, Kelly, as you indicated. I'm seeing that Luis Villegas raised his hand. Did he want to say anything in particular? I believe you answered his question already, didn't you, Kelly?
I'm not sure if I know which question was asked by which person.
He said, according to the 2 latings besluit, that was his question. Did you?
I think I see that one.
It's
according to local laws, the people that apply for refugee status have permission to work. When they go to census, they cannot use this to be included in the civil registry. Yes, I love that question, actually, because I spent a lot of time thinking about that question. So it's more complicated than that. The first one is related to the idea that Censo in general is really complicated. I'm still not in Censo. I've been here for 2 years. They eventually told me that I'm not required to register in Censo, but I have been unable to Censo myself here in Aruba because of this apostille birth certificate business. So we're going to have some issues with Censo that are irrespective of the refugee situation. And I think that's one category of challenges that are coming up. The second one is related to whether or not people who apply for refugee status have permission to work. And my understanding of that is that if, you know, it depends on what application, they changed the law mid last year. So if it was the prior version of the law, you had to have applied for refugee status when you came in, and then you would be allowed to work, but everyone else would not be allowed to work. With the new law, you don't necessarily have the same situation, but you're put in sort of a pre-adjudication procedure, and if they don't finish the case in a certain amount of time, then they can give you the right to work. But the Toelatungsbesluit did not actually define the word can. So you can be given a work permit, but that's not the same thing as you must be given a work permit, and so therefore people are not given a work permit. But yes, it's so that real question of, you know, what is the interaction between the refugee status, the asylum seeker certificate, how does that fit in with Censo? Also, can we convince Censo to make exceptions for people with expired passports who otherwise would fill the conditions? There's a lot that goes into that. And I think it's a really great example of all of the things that are very challenging in dealing with refugees. The systems aren't built to accommodate people who don't come with the same sets of documents and the same set of experiences and the same approach as, for example, a work permit. So do you need a separate work permit or not? Or is the document that you get sufficient? And there's a lot of question marks around that. And DMAS might have a certain perspective, but the employers might not have the same understanding of the value of that document. So in the policy can say one thing, but in the application, it's usually more complicated. So that was a really great, not very clear answer to your question, but the answer is it's complicated.
Yes, and he did thank you for that question. Now, I also want to thank you, as Edward said, for the past hour and a half. It was a very interesting presentation, Kelly, very informative. And I think for many, look at the video again and have it all marinate. And I think next week's lecture presentation is also going to be a very interesting one on which we're going to build based on what you've said here. Maybe you'll be joining us then also as a panel member, who knows? Maybe, maybe there might be some other questions that would tie in that'll be very interesting for you to answer. And I want to thank everyone else that stayed with us during this hour and a half in the Zoom presentation. And we look forward to you participating in next week's presentation, same date, same time. If you haven't registered as yet, I encourage you to do so. And I thank you once again for being part of the Center for Lifelong Learning's mailing list and wanting to be a lifelong learner every day and for the future. Thank you very much. And until we see each other again, have a pleasant evening further.